You clumsy fool! You are
What have you
fired.
done?
Sir, please stop.
Excuse me, what is going on here?
In the heart of Manhattan's most luxurious restaurant, a billionaire CEO publicly humiliated a young waitress. But what happened next turned his entire empire upside down. The city of New York never truly sleeps. Skyscrapers stood tall against the night sky, their windows glowing like stars scattered across steel giants. Among them, at the very top of a glass tower, Richard Coleman looked down at the world he believed he owned. Richard was not just another rich man, he was the billionaire. The kind of man whose name appeared on the covers of Forbes, Wall Street Journal, and every major financial magazine. His empire stretched across technology, luxury goods, and media. People bowed to him, not because they liked him, but because they feared him. Inside his penthouse office, Richard leaned back in a leather chair worth more than most people's yearly salary. A glass of aged scotch sat in his hand, the kind reserved for men who believed time itself could be bought and bottled. His phone buzzed. His assistant's voice came through. "Sir, the reservation at Le Ciel is confirmed for tonight at 8. The board members will be joining you." Richard smirked. Le Ciel wasn't just a restaurant. It was the restaurant, the kind of place where a single meal cost what most families spent on groceries in a month. Exclusive, pretentious, and dripping with sophistication. Exactly the kind of place Richard loved, because it gave him the stage he craved. For Richard, dining wasn't about food. It was about power. Every dinner, every glass of wine, every cutting remark was a performance designed to remind people that he was untouchable. At exactly 8, Richard's sleek black limousine pulled up outside Le Ciel. Cameras flashed. Even here, in a place where celebrities and billionaires blended in, Richard stood out. His tailored suit, custom made in Italy, hugged his broad shoulders. His silver cufflinks bore his initials, as if the world needed reminding. Inside, the restaurant's chandeliers sparkled, casting golden light on white tablecloths and crystal glasses. The air smelled of truffle, seared steak, and ambition. The maitre d' nearly tripped over himself, rushing to greet Richard. "Mr. Coleman, welcome back. Your table is ready." Richard nodded without even making eye contact. To him, people like the maitre d' were invisible background noise in the opera of his life. As Richard sat down, his associates began arriving. They laughed too loudly, shook his hand too eagerly, and complimented him as if he were royalty. Richard basked in it, smirking as he ordered the most expensive wine on the menu before anyone else could even glance at their menus. And then she appeared, Eleanor Price. She was young, barely in her 20s, her hair neatly tied back in a bun. Her uniform was spotless, but her tired eyes gave her away. Eleanor wasn't like the polished waiters who usually floated through Le Ciel. She was new, nervous, but determined. Tonight mattered to her. As she approached Richard's table with a tray of glasses, her heart raced. She knew who he was. Everyone did. Serving Richard Coleman was like walking across a tightrope. One misstep, and you could fall. "Good evening, gentlemen," Eleanor said softly, placing the glasses with careful precision. Her hands trembled slightly, but she kept her smile. Richard glanced up at her, and for the briefest second he saw her. But instead of kindness, his gaze was cold, measuring, already searching for flaws. To Richard, waiters weren't people. They were servants, and servants existed to obey. The dinner began with laughter and business talk. Richard dominated the table, cutting off others mid-sentence, bragging about his latest deal. Eleanor hovered quietly, refilling glasses, placing dishes, trying to stay invisible. But Richard had an eye for weakness, and Eleanor's nervousness was like blood in the water. At one point, when Eleanor placed a dish too close to his left hand, Richard snapped, his voice sharp enough to slice through the room's hum. "Watch what you're doing, girl. Do you have any idea how much this suit costs? The room fell silent for a moment. Eleanor's cheeks burned red. She quickly muttered an apology, her hands shaking as she pulled back the plate. Richard smirked. His associates chuckled awkwardly, following his lead. To them, his cruelty was entertainment, but the other guests in the restaurant exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked away, pretending not to notice. Others whispered under their breath. For Eleanor, the night had only just begun. And for Richard, his arrogance had just lit the fuse of a story that would spiral far beyond this golden dining room. The lights of Le Ciel shimmered like constellations, but Eleanor Price didn't notice. To her, the glow of chandeliers and the gleam of polished silverware meant one thing: pressure. Every plate she carried, every glass she placed, was weighted with the fear of failing. When Richard Coleman's sharp words cut into her moments ago, she had smiled politely and whispered an apology, but inside, her stomach twisted. She had learned long ago that in places like this, one mistake could cost you not only your tip, but your job. And losing this job, that wasn't an option, because Eleanor wasn't here by choice. She was here by necessity. Earlier that day, before she tied her hair into the neat bun and slipped into her uniform, Eleanor stood in her small apartment on the edge of Brooklyn. The place was cramped, the wallpaper peeling, the heater unreliable. In the corner of the bedroom, her mother coughed softly, her frail body bundled in blankets. "Don't worry about me," her mother whispered, as Eleanor placed a bowl of soup on the nightstand. "You need to focus on school. That's your ticket out of all this." Eleanor had forced a smile. She always did. But her mind had been racing, calculating tuition, rent, medical bills, and the paycheck from the restaurant. Every dollar she earned was already spent before it even reached her account. She dreamed of a better life, one where she wouldn't have to run from class to work, where she wouldn't have to plaster on a smile for customers who looked right through her. But dreams didn't pay bills, shifts did. So when her manager called that morning and told her she was assigned to a high-profile table tonight, Richard Coleman's table, she had felt both dread and opportunity. If she did well, the tips would be generous, maybe enough to pay for her mother's next round of medication. But if she messed up, she couldn't even let herself imagine that. Back at the restaurant, Eleanor carried herself with a kind of careful grace that came from desperation, not training. Her shoes pinched, her back ached, but she held her head high. As she poured wine for Richard's associates, she overheard their conversation. "Coleman Industries just closed another deal," one man said proudly, glancing at Richard like a schoolboy seeking approval. "The numbers are through the roof." Richard leaned back, smirking. "Of course they are. People line up to buy what I sell, and if they don't, I make them." Laughter followed, but Eleanor barely listened. She had heard this tone before, from men who thought they ruled the world. But something about Richard was different, sharper, colder, almost cruel in his certainty that nothing could touch him. When she returned to the kitchen, she let out a shaky breath. "You're doing fine," whispered Jamie, another waitress, slipping a hand on her shoulder. "Just breathe. Guys like him, they feed off fear. Don't give him what he wants." Eleanor nodded, but deep down, she wasn't sure she could manage. Her hands wouldn't stop trembling, and Richard seemed to notice every movement she made. As the night dragged on, her thoughts drifted to the future she was chasing. She wanted to graduate. She wanted to be the first in her family to wear a cap and gown, to walk across a stage and know she had built something for herself. Her dream was to become a teacher, to give kids the kind of guidance she never had. But that dream felt so far away when a billionaire's glare could make her feel smaller than dust. Still, she pressed on. She balanced trays, memorized orders, smiled even when her jaw hurt from holding it too long. Because she had to. Because survival left no room for pride. At Richard's table, the energy shifted. The more glasses of wine emptied, the louder his voice became. He bragged about private jets, golf trips in the Bahamas, yachts bigger than most people's homes. His associates laughed at every story, their laughter growing forced, their smiles tight. And then, like a hawk spotting prey, Richard's gaze snapped back to Eleanor. "You there," he barked, snapping his fingers. "Another bottle of the 98 Bordeaux. Not the 99. Don't screw it up." Eleanor's heart sank. She knew the difference, but his tone made her hands clammy. She nodded quickly and hurried off, aware of the eyes that followed her. In the wine cellar, she whispered to herself, steadying her breathing. "Don't mess this up, Ellie. You can't mess this up." When she returned with the bottle, she placed it carefully on the table, twisting the corkscrew with precision. But Richard watched her like a predator, waiting for her to stumble. For a moment, she thought she had done it right. The cork popped smoothly, the wine poured without a drip. Relief washed over her until Richard spoke. "Took you long enough," he sneered. "In the time you wasted, I could have made another million." His associates laughed, and the sound stung worse than any insult. Eleanor's cheeks flushed, but she swallowed her pride and forced a quiet. "My apologies, sir." Richard waved her off like she was a fly buzzing in his ear. That single moment was a crack, small but dangerous, in Eleanor's composure. She had endured rude customers before. She had endured exhaustion, hunger, and stress. But something about Richard's cold disdain dug deeper than the rest. And though the night wasn't over, she could already feel the weight of it pressing down, threatening to crush her spirit. She didn't know it yet, but this evening would change everything. Not just for her, but for Richard Coleman too. The evening had rolled on, laughter echoing from Richard Coleman's table like the roar of lions in a cage. But beneath that laughter, tension simmered. Eleanor Price felt it in her bones with every step she took toward them. Her palms were damp, her shoulders stiff, and her mind ran in circles, rehearsing every detail she had memorized. She couldn't afford to slip "not tonight," not in front of him. The kitchen door swung open as Eleanor carried a tray balanced with 4 steaming plates. The chef had worked tirelessly on this round, prime steaks cooked to perfection, vegetables glistening under the light, sauces reduced to silky elegance. Each plate was worth nearly a week of her paycheck. "Table 12. The expediter barked. Eleanor nodded, forcing a smile. Table 12. Richard's table. The table she had been dreading all evening. As she stepped back onto the restaurant floor, the air seemed heavier, every eye a spotlight. The clinking of silverware and low hum of conversation faded behind the pounding of her heartbeat. She approached Richard's table with practiced grace, lowering the tray to distribute the plates. "This is the house specialty, gentlemen," she said softly, her voice steady despite her nerves. Richard barely glanced at her. He was in the middle of a story, something about closing a deal that had put another small company out of business. His associates laughed, as if destruction was the world's greatest joke. Eleanor placed the first plate, then the second, the third, and then it happened. The tray tilted ever so slightly. A single drop of sauce slid across the rim of Richard's plate and landed just barely on the pristine white tablecloth. It was nothing, almost invisible. Any other customer would have brushed it off, but not Richard Coleman. His voice sliced through the air like glass shattering. "Are you blind?" The room went silent. Forks froze midair. Conversation stopped. Even the music seemed to fade. Eleanor's breath caught in her throat. She looked down, saw the tiny smear of sauce, and felt her stomach drop. I'm so sorry, sir," she whispered, reaching quickly for a napkin. But Richard wasn't finished. He leaned back in his chair, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "Do you even realize how much this suit costs?" he said, his voice loud enough for half the restaurant to hear. "More than you'll make in 10 years waiting tables." His associates chuckled nervously, unsure whether to laugh or stay silent. But Richard's eyes were locked on Eleanor, savoring the way she shrank under his gaze. Eleanor's cheeks burned crimson. She dabbed at the cloth with trembling hands, trying to make the spot disappear. Her chest tightened, her throat ached with the effort of swallowing back tears. I said I'm sorry, she murmured, her voice barely audible. Richard leaned forward, his tone mocking. Sorry doesn't fix incompetence. If you can't handle carrying a tray, maybe you should find another line of work, something that matches your skill level. Laughter erupted from two of his guests, emboldened by his cruelty. Other diners turned to watch. Some whispered. Others looked away, embarrassed for her, but no one spoke up. Eleanor stood frozen for a moment, the napkin still clutched in her hand. She wanted to vanish, to melt into the floor, but her training, her survival instincts, forced her to straighten her shoulders and keep going. Would you like me to bring another tablecloth, sir? She asked, her voice tight but steady. Richard smirked, enjoying the performance. Yes. And do try not to ruin that one too. The table laughed again, but this time it sounded forced, uneasy. Even his closest associates seemed uncomfortable, but no one dared contradict Richard Coleman. Not yet. Eleanor hurried back to the kitchen, her vision blurred. She placed the tray down with shaking hands, gripping the counter until her knuckles turned white. Jamie, the other waitress, rushed to her side. Ellie, breathe. It's just a cloth. Don't let him get to you. But Eleanor shook her head. He wants me to fail. I can feel it. Every move I make, he's waiting to pounce. Jamie sighed, lowering her voice. Guys like him, they think money makes them gods. But one day, they'll learn. Eleanor didn't answer. She couldn't. Her throat was tight, her chest heavy. But she wiped her eyes, forced a smile, and picked up a fresh cloth. Because no matter how much it hurt, quitting wasn't an option. Not when her mother was waiting at home, not when tuition bills were stacked on her desk. She would endure. For now, back at the table, Richard leaned back, clearly pleased with himself. He thrived on moments like this, the power to humiliate, the thrill of control. To him, Eleanor wasn't a person, she was entertainment. But what Richard didn't realize was that this tiny mistake, this single cruel moment, was only the beginning. The night was far from over, and soon, the entire restaurant would be forced to choose sides. The restaurant glowed with golden light, but for Eleanor, the world had narrowed to a single table. Richard Coleman's table. His insults still echoed in her ears, each word replaying like a cruel chorus. Maybe you should find another line of work, something that matches your skill level. She had smiled. She had nodded. She had done everything in her power to keep her composure. But inside, she was unraveling. In the kitchen, Eleanor leaned against the counter, gripping it so tightly that her fingers ached. Jamie squeezed her arm. Don't let him win, Jamie whispered. He wants to see you crack. You're stronger than that. Eleanor nodded, but her eyes betrayed her. They glistened with tears she refused to let fall. Not here, not in front of him. The manager, Mark Rivera, stepped over, his brow furrowed. You all right, Eleanor? Yes, she lied. I'm fine. But Mark wasn't convinced. He'd been in this business long enough to recognize the look of someone being pushed past their limit. He wanted to intervene. But with Richard Coleman, even managers had to tread carefully. Take a breath, he said gently. And remember, you belong here as much as anyone sitting out there. Into all DUs. Eleanor took a deep breath and forced herself back onto the floor. The clatter of cutlery, the murmur of conversations, the soft notes of the piano, it all washed over her as background noise. All she could hear was her heartbeat and the low rumble of Richard's laughter. She approached his table again, carrying a large tray stacked with wine glasses and fresh plates. Her arms trembled under the weight, but she steadied herself. Stay calm, she whispered under her breath. Just one more round. You can do this. As she neared the table, Richard glanced up. His eyes gleamed with the same cold amusement a cat shows before swatting at a mouse. He elbowed one of his associates and smirked. Watch this, he muttered. Eleanor bent down, carefully placing the first plate, then the second. For a moment, everything went smoothly. She reached for the third, and her wrist wobbled. The tray tipped. Time seemed to slow. Crystal glasses clinked, sliding toward the edge. A cascade of red wine splashed like blood across the pristine white tablecloth. One glass tipped over completely, spilling its contents across Richard's sleeve. The restaurant gasped as one. Eleanor froze. Her face drained of color. Oh God, I'm so sorry, she stammered, fumbling for a napkin. But Richard shot up from his chair, his voice booming loud enough for every corner of the restaurant to hear. You idiot, he roared. Do you have any idea who I am? Do you even realize how much this jacket costs? This is custom tailored from Milan. You couldn't afford the buttons on this thing. Eleanor's hands shook as she dabbed at the fabric. I didn't mean... Of course you didn't mean it, Richard barked. That's the problem. You're careless, worthless. People like you don't belong in places like this. You should be cleaning floors, not serving men of my caliber. His words echoed through the restaurant like a whip crack. Eleanor's throat closed up. She wanted to disappear, to sink into the floor and never come back. Tears welled in her eyes, but she blinked furiously, refusing to let them fall. The silence was suffocating. Guests shifted uncomfortably in their chairs. Some glared at Richard, others looked away in shame. A couple sitting nearby whispered to each other, their expressions tight with disapproval. But Richard didn't care. He basked in the attention, feeding on the power of humiliation. Pathetic, he muttered, sinking back into his chair. Utterly pathetic. Eleanor stumbled back, clutching the tray to her chest. Her vision blurred, her chest heaving. For a moment, she thought she might faint. She turned and hurried toward the kitchen, but the damage was done. Everyone had seen, everyone had heard. Behind her, whispers rose. That poor girl, what a monster. I can't believe he spoke to her like that. But no one stepped forward. Not yet. In the kitchen, Eleanor set the tray down with shaking hands. She leaned against the wall, gasping for breath. Jamie rushed to her side again, pulling her into a quick hug. You don't deserve this, Jamie murmured. He's not worth your tears. But Eleanor couldn't stop the tears now. They spilled down her cheeks as she whispered, I just wanted to get through the night. Not. Mark Rivera appeared, his jaw tight. He had heard enough. He had seen enough. His staff were not pawns to be abused for a billionaire's entertainment. Stay here, he said firmly, placing a hand on Eleanor's shoulder. I'll handle this. Back in the dining room, Richard was still grumbling, waving his hand dismissively as if nothing had happened. His associates chuckled half-heartedly, but their eyes darted nervously around the room. The rest of the guests sat in uncomfortable silence. Then Mark Rivera stepped forward, his presence calm but commanding. The entire restaurant turned to watch. And in that moment, the balance of power began to shift. The hush in the restaurant was almost eerie. Forks hovered midair, conversations had died, and even the pianist's hands froze above the keys. All eyes turned toward the man who dared to break the silence, Mark Rivera, the restaurant's manager. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with years of service, industry resilience etched into his features. His expression was calm, too calm, and his measured steps carried an authority that demanded respect. He stopped at Richard's table. Mr. Coleman, Mark said evenly, his voice steady but firm, I need to have a word with you. Richard leaned back in his chair, wine-stained sleeves spread out as if to display his grievance. He smirked. Ah, the manager. Finally. I was wondering when someone would come crawling over to apologize. But Mark didn't bow. He didn't smile. He simply stood tall. This is not an apology, he said. The words seemed to ripple through the air, shocking both the guests and Richard's associates. Richard's smirk faltered for a brief second, then twisted into a sneer. Excuse me? You heard me, Mark said. This is not an apology. What I just witnessed, what everyone in this restaurant just witnessed, was unacceptable. You publicly humiliated one of my staff, and that will not be tolerated here. Gasps traveled across the room. Eleanor, peeking from the kitchen doorway with tear-streaked cheeks, covered her mouth in disbelief. Richard's face flushed crimson, half from the wine stain and half from indignation. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he thundered. "I am Richard Coleman. I own companies that employ thousands of people. I could buy this restaurant with the spare change in my pocket. And you," he jabbed a finger at Mark, "you're a glorified waiter who should be grateful." "I even set foot in this establishment." Mark didn't flinch. His eyes remained locked on Richard's, steady and unyielding. "With all due respect, Mr. Coleman," he replied, "your wealth does not excuse cruelty. This restaurant does not measure people by their bank accounts. We measure them by their humanity. And tonight, sir, yours is sorely lacking." The room was silent for a beat. Then a murmur swept through the guests, voices rising in agreement. "He's right." Finally, someone said it. "That poor waitress. She didn't deserve that." Richard's associates shifted uncomfortably in their seats, exchanging nervous glances. One of them muttered something about maybe leaving soon. But Richard slammed his fist on the table. "You think you can lecture me," he spat. "You'll regret this. I could destroy this restaurant with a single phone call. You'll be finished." Mark's jaw tightened. He took a breath, then spoke with the clarity of a man who had made his choice. "If standing up for my staff costs me this restaurant, then so be it. But I will not allow anyone, billionaire or not, to demean the people who keep this place alive." The guests erupted in quiet applause, hesitant at first, but quickly swelling into something undeniable. A woman at a corner table stood and said loudly, "Well said." Others nodded, clapping along. Richard's eyes darted around the room, fury boiling beneath his polished exterior. He wasn't used to this public disapproval, open resistance. He was accustomed to rooms falling silent out of fear, not rising against him in solidarity. Eleanor, still standing in the kitchen doorway, felt her heart hammer in her chest. For the first time that night, she didn't feel small. She didn't feel powerless. She felt seen. Richard shot to his feet, pointing a shaking finger at Mark. "This isn't over," he growled. "You'll regret crossing me." Mark met his glare head on. "Perhaps, but at least I'll be able to look my staff in the eye." The line landed like a hammer, and the guests broke into another wave of applause, this time louder, stronger, unafraid. The pianist, sensing the shift in mood, began playing again, a bold, triumphant melody filling the air. Richard stood frozen, his face a mask of rage and disbelief. He was losing control of the room, and he knew it. For a man who thrived on power, the realization was unbearable. But before he could respond, something even more unexpected happened. A man at another table, one of the restaurant's longtime patrons, rose from his seat and addressed Richard directly. "You call yourself a leader," the man said, his voice carrying across the room. "But leaders lift others up. They don't tear them down. What you showed tonight wasn't power. It was weakness." The room erupted again, this time not just in applause, but in voices supporting Eleanor, condemning Richard's behavior, praising Mark's courage. For the first time in years, Richard Coleman felt cornered. Not by rivals in boardrooms or journalists with sharp questions, but by something far more dangerous to his pride. Ordinary people refusing to bow to him. His hands shook as he grabbed his jacket, still damp with wine. "We're leaving," he snapped at his associates, his voice quivering with barely restrained fury. They stood reluctantly, clearly embarrassed to be in his orbit. As they shuffled out, the applause continued, not for Richard, but against him. And in the kitchen doorway, Eleanor whispered through trembling lips, "Thank you, Mark." After the doors closed and the final tables were cleared, the staff gathered in the empty dining hall. The air smelled of extinguished candles and lemon polish, but the tension lingered thick as smoke. Eleanor sat at a corner table, her apron folded in her lap. Her hands trembled, though she tried to hide it. Jamie perched beside her, squeezing her shoulder. "You did nothing wrong," Jamie whispered. "I spilled wine on him," Eleanor muttered. "That wasn't your fault," Mark said, stepping forward. His tone was steady, but his eyes were shadowed. He was waiting for a chance to humiliate you. That tray could have been empty, and he still would have found a reason to cut you down. And knows this. Eleanor looked up at him, her throat tight. But now he's angry. What if he really does ruin this place? Mark hesitated. He had faced plenty of arrogant customers in his career, but none with Richard Coleman's wealth and reach. Still, he couldn't let fear dictate his response. If he tries, Mark said firmly, then we'll face it together. This restaurant is more than one man's ego. But in the silence that followed, no one entirely believed his words. Across town, in a penthouse overlooking the glittering skyline, Richard Coleman poured himself another glass of scotch. His jacket hung over a chair, the red stain glaring at him like an accusation. He couldn't let it go. He had built his empire on control over markets, over people, over every situation he stepped into. And tonight, that control had slipped through his fingers in front of an audience, in front of nobodies. His associates sat stiffly across from him, silent. They had learned long ago not to speak when Richard was in this mood. He paced in front of the floor-to-ceiling windows, his reflection fractured against the city lights. They applauded him, Richard snarled. The manager, the waitress, as if they were heroes, and I, his voice cracked with fury, as if I was the villain. He downed the drink in one swallow, then slammed the glass onto the marble counter. No one humiliates me, he growled. No one. The next morning, a storm began to brew. It started with a phone call. Mark's office line rang before the restaurant even opened. He picked it up, his coffee barely touched. "This is Rivera," he said. A cool, professional voice answered. "Mr. Rivera, this is the Department of Public Health. We've received an anonymous complaint about unsanitary conditions at your establishment. We'll need to conduct an inspection immediately." Mark's stomach dropped. He glanced around at his spotless office, the framed certificates of cleanliness and safety on the wall. "There's been a mistake," he said, but the voice was unmoved. "We'll be there within the hour." By noon, inspectors combed through the restaurant, flashlights in hand, noting every crumb, every smudge. The staff whispered nervously in the corners, watching as clipboards filled with notes. Eleanor's chest tightened with dread. "This is him," she whispered to Jamie. "This is Richard. He's doing this." Jamie bit her lip, unwilling to say it, but unable to deny it. Mark followed the inspectors, answering questions, producing records, keeping his composure. But inside, fury burned. He knew exactly who had set this in motion. Richard had money, connections, and the spite to use them. By evening, the restaurant was slapped with a temporary citation, forcing them to close for 2 days while issues were reviewed. 2 days of lost business. 2 days of staff without pay. Eleanor sank into a chair as the news spread. Her chest felt heavy, guilt crushing her ribs. "This is because of me," she whispered. "No," Mark said sharply. "This is because of him. Don't you dare take his cruelty on your shoulders." But as the staff filed out, one by one, uncertainty clung to them like a fog. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman sat in his penthouse again, scrolling through his phone. News articles had begun to surface. Coleman seen in heated argument at Midtown Bistro. Restaurant staff stands up to billionaire CEO. Some headlines even included shaky cell phone footage taken by guests during the confrontation. Eleanor's tear-streaked face, Richard's furious words, Mark's steady rebuttal. The public had opinions, and many of them were not on Richard's side. Richard clenched his jaw, hurling the phone onto the couch. "They think they can turn me into the villain?" he muttered. "Fine. Let them try. I'll show them what happens when you cross me." His eyes glittered with cold determination. This wasn't just about a spilled drink anymore. It was about pride, power, and crushing anyone who dared to challenge him. And for Eleanor and the restaurant, the storm had only just begun. The Midtown Bistro's doors were locked, its lights dim, and a bright orange notice from the Department of Public Health hung across the glass. For 2 days, the restaurant sat in silence, its once bustling dining room reduced to a ghostly echo of laughter and clinking glasses. For Eleanor, those 48 hours felt like a lifetime. She sat in her small apartment, staring at her phone as videos of the confrontation spread like wildfire. The clip was everywhere. TikTok, Instagram, Twitter, even morning talk shows. Millions of people had watched Richard Coleman sneer at her, call her worthless, while she stood frozen in humiliation. But what surprised her wasn't the cruelty of the moment, it was the response. Comments flooded in beneath every post. That poor waitress. She handled herself with more grace than that billionaire ever could. Actually so's. Shout out to the manager, what a legend. This is why I don't trust guys with too much money. They think the world owes them everything. And then came the hashtags. Stand with Eleanor. Service industry strong. Coleman exposed. Eleanor's name was suddenly everywhere. She wasn't invisible anymore, she was a symbol. Meanwhile, Richard Coleman was discovering the double-edged sword of fame. At first, he dismissed the videos as noise. People always ranted online. Attention spans were short. But within hours, news outlets picked up the story. Anchors debated it on live television. Journalists dug up old interviews where Richard had spoken arrogantly about his employees, his rivals, even his own family. By the third day, stockholders were calling. Richard, one board member said during a heated conference call, "This is bad optics. Your face is everywhere, and none of it is good. We need a statement, an apology, something." "Apologize?" Richard barked. "To a waitress? To a room full of nobodies who don't even understand what success looks like? Never." The board member sighed. "Then brace yourself, because the market reacts to perception, not pride." Richard slammed the laptop shut, his reflection in the screen twisted with rage. Back at Midtown Bistro, the staff gathered on reopening day. Eleanor walked in nervously, her apron in hand. For the first time, strangers on the street had recognized her, offering smiles or nods of encouragement. Jamie rushed up and hugged her. "You're famous," she laughed. "Do you realize that? People are literally making fan art of you standing up to him?" Eleanor blushed. "I didn't stand up. Mark did. I just cried." But Mark, overhearing, stepped forward. "You showed grace when most people would have broken. Don't minimize that." As the night unfolded, something remarkable happened. Customers filled the tables, not just regulars, but new faces. People who had seen the story online came from across the city to show support. "I saw the video," one woman told Eleanor as she placed her order. "You reminded me of my daughter, who works nights at a diner. I just wanted to say thank you for being strong." Another guest slipped Eleanor a small note with her tip. "Keep your head high. We're all rooting for you." For the first time in months, Eleanor felt something stir inside her pride. But the shadow of Richard still loomed. Late that evening, as Eleanor carried a tray of desserts to a family, her phone buzzed. She glanced at the screen. A message from an unknown number. "Enjoy the attention while it lasts. I always win in the end." Her hands shook so badly she nearly dropped the tray. She shoved the phone into her apron and forced herself to keep moving, but her chest burned with fear. Across town, Richard sat in his office, smirking as he watched news clips. Though the headlines skewed against him, he refused to yield. "They'll move on," he muttered. "They always do." But then his assistant entered, pale-faced, holding a tablet. "Sir, you need to see this." On the screen was a viral post. A young woman in Chicago had shared her story of working under one of Coleman's subsidiary companies. Her words painted a damning picture of exploitation, arrogance, and bullying. Then another story surfaced, and another. Former employees, waitstaff, assistants, all coming forward. Within hours, Coleman culture was trending worldwide. Richard's empire wasn't just under scrutiny anymore, it was under siege. Back at the restaurant, Eleanor sat with Jamie and Mark after closing. The three of them sipped coffee in the quiet dining room, exhaustion etched into their faces, but hope flickering in their eyes. "You've started something bigger than you realize," Mark said softly, looking at Eleanor. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about every worker who's ever been treated like they're invisible." Eleanor shook her head. "I never wanted to start anything. I just wanted to do my job." Jamie smiled. "Sometimes that's how change begins. Ordinary people doing ordinary things until someone tries to break them, and instead they rise." Eleanor looked down at her hands. They were still trembling, but not from fear this time, from something else. Resolve. Richard Coleman thought he was untouchable, but now the voices of ordinary people were rising, louder, stronger, unstoppable. And for the first time, Eleanor wondered if maybe, just maybe, the billionaire was finally about to learn a lesson he couldn't buy his way out of. Richard Coleman had built his empire on two pillars: money and fear. For decades, that was enough. People didn't question him, because questioning him meant risking their jobs, their reputations, their futures. But now, for the first time, both pillars were crumbling. Monday morning. The glass towers of Manhattan reflected the rising sun, but inside one of those towers, Richard's boardroom was ice cold. Screens lit the walls with headlines. "Employees speak out against Coleman Industries." "Viral video sparks nationwide debate." "Stand with Eleanor hits 50 million views." Richard sat at the head of the table, jaw tight, hands gripping the armrests of his chair. "This is temporary," he said through clenched teeth. "Public outrage doesn't last. They'll find another scandal tomorrow." But the board wasn't buying it. A silver-haired member leaned forward. "Richard, this isn't going away. Former employees are talking to the press. Regulators are calling for investigations. Our stock dropped 12% this morning. Investors are panicking." Richard slammed a fist on the table. "Because of a waitress? You're telling me my empire is collapsing because some nobody spilled a glass of wine?" The silence that followed was deafening. Finally, another board member spoke. "No, Richard. It's collapsing because of you." Meanwhile, at Midtown Bistro, Eleanor's life had turned upside down. Customers poured in daily, not just for the food, but for her. They wanted to meet the waitress who had endured Coleman's wrath with grace. Some asked for photos. Others shared their own stories of bad bosses, unfair treatment, impossible jobs. It was overwhelming, but also empowering. For once, Eleanor didn't feel invisible. That evening, a local news crew arrived, cameras in hand. The reporter smiled warmly as she adjusted the mic. "Eleanor, you've become the face of a movement. How does it feel?" Eleanor froze. 1,000 thoughts rushed through her head. She wasn't a leader. She wasn't an activist. She was just a waitress trying to make rent. But then she remembered Mark's words. "This isn't just about you anymore. It's about every worker who's ever been treated like they're invisible." So she took a breath and spoke. "I didn't ask for this," she began. "But if my story helps people remember that everyone deserves respect, no matter what their job is, then maybe something good can come out of what happened." The clip aired that night, and within hours, it was trending nationwide. Eleanor's trembling voice became a rallying cry. Richard watched the interview from his penthouse, his face twisted with rage. "She thinks she's a hero now?" he snarled, pacing the room. "She's nothing without me. Nobody even knew her name until I gave her the spotlight." His assistant shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, maybe it would help if you issued an apology. A public one. It could calm things down." Richard stopped in his tracks, his glare icy. Apologize? To her? Never. But as he looked back at the screen at Eleanor's tear-bright eyes, her voice quivering, but resolute, something stirred deep inside him. Not remorse, not guilt, something darker. If the public wanted a villain, he would show them one. 2 days later, Eleanor received a letter in the mail. It was thick, embossed with a corporate seal. Her hands shook as she opened it. It was a legal notice. Richard Coleman was suing her for defamation. The news hit like a bombshell. The restaurant buzzed with outrage as the staff read the letter over her shoulder. "He's suing you? For what?" Jamie shouted. "He's the one who humiliated you." Mark's face darkened. This isn't about winning. He knows he won't win. This is about scaring her, about draining her with lawyers and court fees until she breaks. Eleanor's stomach twisted. "I don't have money for a lawyer. I can barely pay rent." Jamie slammed her fist on the counter. "Then we'll help you. You're not fighting this alone." And they didn't have to. By nightfall, news of the lawsuit had spread online. Within hours, a crowdfunding campaign launched. Help Eleanor fight back. Donations poured in from across the country, 10, 20, 100 at a time. By morning, she had enough to hire a legal team. The public wasn't just on her side anymore. They were ready to fight with her. Richard sat in his office the next day, watching the numbers climb. Every dollar donated felt like a knife in his pride. This is war, he muttered. But what he failed to see was that the war was already turning against him. His arrogance, his cruelty, his refusal to bend, those were no longer strengths. They were the cracks in his empire. And Eleanor, the waitress he had dismissed as invisible, had become the hammer striking at those cracks. The courthouse steps were crowded with cameras, microphones, and protesters holding signs. Some read, "Justice for Eleanor." Others shouted, "Respect workers," or "Coleman's time is up." Reporters swarmed as Eleanor arrived, flanked by her attorney and a handful of restaurant staff who had insisted on standing by her. She wore a simple navy dress, her hair pulled back, no makeup, no glamour, just herself. She looked nervous, but when she caught sight of Jamie waving from the crowd and Mark giving her a nod of encouragement, she straightened her shoulders. This wasn't just about her anymore. Inside, the courtroom buzzed with anticipation. On one side sat Eleanor, quiet but composed. On the other sat Richard Coleman in a $1,000 suit, his presence filling the space with practiced authority. His lawyers lined up beside him, armed with binders and arrogance. The judge entered, and silence fell. "Case of Coleman v. Parker," the clerk announced. Richard's attorney was first to speak. He painted Eleanor as an opportunist, a nobody who had exploited an innocent accident to gain fame and fortune at Richard's expense. "This young woman," the lawyer declared, gesturing toward Eleanor, "spilled wine on my client, humiliated him in front of his peers, and has since led a campaign to tarnish his reputation. Mr. Coleman's businesses are suffering because of her actions." Richard nodded along smugly, as if every word was gospel. Then Eleanor's lawyer stood, calm, methodical. He didn't raise his voice, but his words carried weight. "Ladies and gentlemen, this case is not about spilled wine. It is not about a damaged jacket. It is about power and how one man abused it." He gestured toward the screen set up in the courtroom. Exhibit A. The viral video played. Richard's voice filled the room. "Do you have any idea who I am? You should be cleaning floors, not serving men of my caliber." The jury shifted uncomfortably. Some frowned. Others glanced at Eleanor, her cheeks burning as she relived the humiliation. Richard's jaw tightened. He hadn't realized how damning his own words sounded when played without the armor of his presence. The defense attorney continued. Exhibit B, testimonies. One by one, former employees took the stand. A secretary from his company, a young intern, even a chauffeur. Each told their story of bullying, of long hours without respect, of threats disguised as motivation. "He told me I'd never make it anywhere else," the secretary said, her voice trembling. "That I was replaceable. That I should be grateful just to be in his office." The courtroom listened in silence. Richard's reputation, once untouchable, was unraveling thread by thread. By afternoon, Eleanor herself was called to testify. She walked to the stand slowly, her palms sweaty, her heart pounding. For a moment, She thought she might faint under Richard's glare. But then she saw the jury's eyes, watching, waiting, listening. She took a deep breath. "I never wanted this," she began. "That night, I just wanted to do my job. But instead, I was treated like I didn't matter, like I wasn't even human." And when I cried, he smiled. Her voice wavered, but she pressed on. "I'm not here for revenge. I'm here because no one should have to feel the way I felt that night, like they're invisible, like their dignity can be bought and sold. People deserve respect. No matter how much money they have, no matter where they work, no matter who they are." The courtroom was silent. Even the judge leaned forward slightly. Her expression softened. Eleanor's words didn't just hang in the air, they pierced it. When cross-examination came, Richard's lawyer tried to paint her as emotional, unstable, seeking attention. "Isn't it true you've gained thousands of followers online? That you've received donations? That you're profiting from this incident?" Eleanor met his gaze steadily. "I didn't ask for followers. I didn't ask for donations. People helped me because he tried to destroy me, and all I've done is survive." The jury nodded. The lawyer sat down, defeated. Finally, Richard himself took the stand. His lawyers had insisted it was their last card. He strode to the witness box with his usual confidence, adjusting his cufflinks. "They're all exaggerating," he said smoothly. "I run companies. I demand excellence. Sometimes that means being blunt. That doesn't make me a monster." He smirked slightly, glancing at the jury. "Frankly, this is a witch hunt. A waitress made a mistake, I reacted, and now the internet wants to crucify me. If that's justice, then God help us all." His words were polished, but his tone dripped with disdain. And then, in a moment of unchecked pride, he slipped. "These people," he said, waving a hand toward Eleanor and the other witnesses, "are beneath me. They always have been. That's just the truth." The courtroom gasped. Eleanor's lawyer froze, then smiled faintly. "Nothing further, Your Honor," he said. By the time closing arguments ended, the tension was unbearable. Reporters scribbled furiously. The jury whispered among themselves. Eleanor sat quietly, hands folded, heart racing. She had told her truth. Now it was out of her hands. Across the room, Richard adjusted his tie, still convinced of his victory. But deep down, for the first time, doubt gnawed at him. Because the empire he thought was untouchable was crumbling right before his eyes. The jury had been gone for hours. Eleanor sat in the courtroom, staring at the floor, her heart pounding with every tick of the clock. Mark sat behind her, his hand on her shoulder, whispering, "Whatever happens, you've already won." Across the aisle, Richard leaned back in his chair, looking bored. He checked his watch, tapped his fingers on the table. To him, this was just a formality. He had money, power, connections. Juries could be swayed, judges could be pressured. In his mind, the outcome was already written. Finally, the doors opened. The jury filed back in. The room stilled. "Has the jury reached a verdict?" the judge asked. The foreman, a middle-aged man with tired eyes, stood. "We have, Your Honor." The room seemed to shrink. Eleanor felt her chest tighten, as if the walls were closing in. "In the case of Coleman versus Parker," the foreman began, "we find in favor of the defendant, Eleanor Parker." Gasps filled the courtroom. Eleanor's knees almost buckled. Mark gripped her hand tight as relief flooded through her. But the foreman wasn't finished. "And furthermore, in light of overwhelming testimony, we recommend investigation into Mr. Richard Coleman for workplace misconduct, harassment, and abuse of power." The room erupted. Reporters scrambled, cameras flashed, the buzz of voices rising like a storm. Eleanor sat frozen, tears streaming down her face. Richard shot to his feet. "This is outrageous," he thundered. "You can't do this to me. Do you know who I am?" The judge banged the gavel sharply. "Order in the court. Mr. Coleman, sit down or you will be held in contempt." But Richard didn't sit. His face turned red, veins bulging at his temples. I own this city. You're all nothing without me. His words echoed, hollow and desperate. For the first time, the mask of power slipped, and everyone saw him for what he truly was. Not a titan, not a leader, but a man terrified of losing control. Outside the courthouse, the crowd was electric. When Eleanor stepped out, the cheers nearly knocked the breath from her lungs. Cameras flashed, microphones stretched toward her, people chanting her name. She hesitated, overwhelmed. Then she raised a trembling hand, not to wave, but to silence the noise. I'm not a hero, she said, her voice cracking but steady. I'm just a person who wanted to be treated with respect. Today's verdict isn't just mine. It belongs to everyone who's ever been told they don't matter. Everyone who's ever been silenced. We all deserve dignity. We all deserve to be seen. The crowd roared, not just for her words, but for what they meant. She wasn't just Eleanor Parker, Waitress. She had become the voice of millions. For Richard, the fall was swift and brutal. By evening, his face plastered the news not as a billionaire, but as a disgraced CEO. Stockholders pulled out, sponsors cut ties, government agencies announced official investigations, employees lined up to testify against him, no longer afraid. The empire he had built on fear collapsed, brick by brick, under the weight of his own arrogance. He returned to his penthouse that night, alone. No reporters waited outside anymore. No assistants rushed to greet him. The silence was suffocating. For years, he had believed power made him untouchable. But now, staring at the empty walls of his palace in the sky, he realized the truth. Power without respect was nothing. And respect was something he had never earned. Weeks later, Midtown Bistro was busier than ever. The little restaurant had become a symbol, a place people visited not just for food, but for hope. Eleanor still worked there, though her life had changed in ways she couldn't have imagined. She had been offered jobs, interviews, even book deals. But she turned most of it down, because for her, this wasn't about fame. It was about people, about standing up for what was right. One evening, after closing, Mark found her wiping down tables, humming softly to herself. You could leave this place, you know, he said gently. You could do anything now. Eleanor smiled faintly. Maybe someday, but right now, I think this is where I'm meant to be. Mark chuckled. The girl who humbled a billionaire, and she still won't quit her waitressing job? Eleanor shrugged. It's not about what I do. It's about how I do it. And as long as I do it with dignity, that's enough. She looked out the window at the city lights, glowing bright against the night sky. For the first time in a long time, she felt seen. She felt whole. She felt free. Epilogue. Months later, Richard's trial for workplace abuse began. Cameras once again swarmed the courthouse, but this time, no one was there to support him. Meanwhile, Eleanor continued to work, continued to live simply. People still recognized her, still whispered her name, but she remained grounded. Because at the end of the day, she wasn't defined by what had been done to her. She was defined by how she chose to rise above it. And in that quiet strength, she had become something Richard could never buy with all his billions. She had become unforgettable.